Well, there's a tweet for everything from Donald Trump. The man is prolific on Twitter and has been for years. Let me draw your attention to this tweet issued by the president on December 2nd, 2016, just a couple of weeks after his election, before his inauguration. He said, "The president of Taiwan called me today to wish me congratulations on winning the presidency. Thank you." And that tweet caused a ruckus because, of course, ever since communist China was welcomed into the world community, well, it pushed aside the Republic of China, otherwise known as Taiwan. That's the much smaller liberal democracy just across the Strait of Formosa. So Donald Trump, the incoming president, talking to the president of Taiwan and bragging about it was quite something. Well, very prescient, as with so many of Donald Trump's early premonitions about China. Taiwan is turning out to be the good guy, saving the day in many cases, while all of Trump's suspicions about communist China have unfortunately proven true. So what about Canada? Are we learning the hard lessons of our over-closeness with Beijing? Joining us now via Skype from Ottawa is our friend Manny Montenegrino, the CEO of Think Sharp and an astute observer of politics. Manny, welcome back. Great to see you.
Great to be with you, Ezra. Thank you.
You know, it's always a pleasure, and you're always a fan favorite. And I like to stand back and let you just run, because you always come very researched with a lot of things to say. So let me get out of the way. What are your thoughts, Manny?
Well, the big question is, why is this liberal government so close to China when there's so much evidence? We'll start with recent, and we'll go back in time as well. Recently, we know that we have Michael Spavor and Michael Kovig, now I think on their 515th day, that they've been just snatched and not even received any charges, or let alone a trial. We don't know why they are in prison. You think that alone would get a prime minister very upset at a regime that's done that. But for some reason, this prime minister has not. And Ezra, I liken it to another human rights case. And this is how I measured. And at the end of this, Ezra, you and your viewers will ask, what is going on? What is behind this? And I bring you to Raif Badawi. And you might recall, he was the Saudi citizen who was tried under Saudi law, and I believe it's a Sharia law system, where he was blogging and saying something offensive to the crown prince, and he received a jail sentence. Well, this is a Saudi citizen who was within the regime of Saudi Arabia and received a harsh sentence. Well, the prime minister stood up and he became the champion, he said, for human rights, and he scolded Saudi Arabia. That caused the end of relationships as we knew it with Saudi Arabia, and it actually, we've lost, and I think to this day, we still don't have an ambassador there. And that was our prime minister standing up for a citizen, not of Canada, but of Saudi Arabia, who was properly duly, under the laws of Saudi Arabia, found to have breached the laws and sentenced. Now, of course, it's harsh and of course it's wrong. But here we have two Canadians, not Chinese citizens, who have been thrown in a cell, don't even know what the charges were. Badawi knew his charges. He was blogging disrespectfully to the king and the prince, and that caused a criminal charge and a criminal conviction. So at one time, our prime minister was the spokesman for human rights, yet he's silent for China on two Canadians. There are 1 million Muslims in China who are imprisoned and treated because of their religious beliefs. The prime minister is silent on these people. So I don't know why this prime minister is very silent with China. And today, we know the COVID-19 situation. We know the following facts. We know that it certainly came from China. There is strong evidence compelling evidence that China hid and lied and concealed this deadly disease. Mm-hmm. And there's even strong, provable evidence that it may have come from a lab. That should be enough for the Prime Minister to join America, Australia, and the United Kingdom that are saying that China has to be reckoned with what they've done in the world, and he hasn't.
Yeah. You know, you said so many important things there. I take your point about Raif Badawi. I think we can all agree his harsh treatment is offensive to our Western liberal norms, but he was not a Canadian citizen whose obligations and duties and protections were the matter of our Prime Minister. And yet Trudeau is, if only he cared as much about the two Canadians in China as he cared about a foreign national in his country.
Yeah. And in addition,
go ahead.
Sorry, Ezra, but in addition, at least he received a charge. The charge was clear.
Right.
It was tried, and he was sentenced. Now, it's offensive to me and to any free-thinking Canadian that he would be charged, but there is a clear charge. We have Canadians that don't even know what they did wrong, what their charges are. Well, I mean, that's offensive.
What gets me is that in February, just after the 1-year anniversary of I call it a hostage taking or a kidnapping.
Yeah.
That's really what it is, because I don't want to give it I don't want to deodorize it and call it an arrest and detention. That makes it sound like it was a proper legal process. The Chinese government itself has made it crystal clear this is just a tit for tat to get their Chinese national release from house arrest in Vancouver. Anyways.
Yeah, so in addition to the human rights, Ezra, so here's the Prime Minister puts himself out on the world stage, taking on Saudi Arabia, and he wanted to be the human rights champion. Well, that failed, but that's human rights. Now let's go to his other pillar of importance to him, and that is the environment. The Prime Minister has tried to make himself as the voice for the environment movement. Well, now let's look at China. China, and he's been silent on the environment as China pollutes and for instance, CO2 emissions. China in the last 6 or 7 years has doubled its CO2 emissions, whereas Canada and America have reduced their CO2 emissions. Trudeau was silent on his second pillar of strength, which is environment. Trudeau is silent. I mean, we see the tug and pull of oil. But China buys $5 billion worth of coal from BC. Mm-hmm. Trudeau's silent on that. So so you look at the two pillars and you sit there and say human rights, silent, environment, silent, and both times China's been very egregious.
You know, it's interesting you mentioned that, because just this week or a few days ago, Angus Reid released a new poll on Canadian attitudes towards China. And what I really like about Angus Reid is just the questions he asks. They really get to the heart of it, and they're not Ottawa insider questions, because he's based there on the West Coast, so he's got a bit of room to think for himself. And he said, should Canada place more emphasis on trade or human rights and the rule of law? And I think that's a great question, because it allows Canadians to say, yeah, I am a moral person. There's more to me and more to being Canadian and more to life than just money. And the number of Canadians who say it's important to value these principles, there is something to a Canadian identity, we believe in something, very impressive. I found it so reassuring. I mean, these are tough times, Manny, but to know that fellow Canadians actually believe overwhelmingly in right and wrong in dealing with China, I found that encouraging. But it goes to your point.
Well, like a
gap between what Trudeau says about the environment and how he treats China, what he says about human rights, how he treats China. Why? The question is, why is he so far away from the rest of the world's opinion, including Canadians' opinion?
Well, like a good lawyer, Ezra, I anticipated your brilliant research on the poll. I read that poll and I looked at the trade. So that's my third observation for you. China trade. China buys from Canada $15 billion of assorted goods. Mm-hmm. We buy from China $50 billion. So even on the trade, we are are losing. We have a trade deficit of $35 billion. So if we take, let's assume you give any credibility to Prime Minister Trudeau, and he's worried about trade. Well, let's forget the human rights. Let's forget the environment. Let's look at trade. We have a trade deficit. You know what Trump did with the trade deficit of China? He's smacking them around. He's saying, hey, America's buying 800 billion or 600 billion from you, and you're only buying 100 billion from us. We are going to push you around. We should be doing the same thing. In fact, we're being pushed around, and we're a big client. Now, $50 billion to Canada, you know, I mean, you look at our total GDP of $2 trillion, that's a lot. That's a bigger number than 15 billion is to China. Right. So here we are. Why? So even on the trade aspect, Ezra, he should be pushing, saying, look, send those kids home. We're buying $50 billion worth of stuff from you. You're buying 15. We really don't need you. Smarten up. Be part of the world community. Tell us what you're doing with COVID. We're not pushing around. And if you look, Ezra, our key allies, United States under Trump, is starting to point the finger at China, and deservingly so. UK is doing it. Australia. Now, Ezra, on trade, God bless Australia. Mm-hmm. They are taking China on, and they're right next to Australia, and 38% of their trade is with China. They're putting 38% of their future with a contest and pointing out China. You know, our $15 billion on a $2 trillion economy is less than 1%. I think we can spare that less than 1%. I mean, we shut down the economy for COVID. We could spare 1% for human rights, for the environment, and for our two young men that have been in prison and don't even know why.
Yeah. You know, you're so right about Australia. And China is really ratcheting up its threats to Australia. And I've observed China for a while. I know you have too. They play this game with their regional neighbors. So if Taiwan or Vietnam or other countries in the neighborhood get a little too democratic sounding, China talks about, well, maybe we'll invade, and they have military exercises. So they really like to intimidate. They're trying that diplomatic tactic on Australia, and it seems to be extremely backfiring. It's hardening the resolve of Australians. As you say, Australia is quite integrated in China. It will hurt them to do this, but China is just basically saying, yeah, it's a shakedown. What are you going to do about it? And Australia is saying, well, we're going to call your bluff because we've had enough. I'm so impressed with that country. Yeah. I come back to Canada. I mean, other than North Korea, I don't know any country that is still so tied and in love with China. I mean, even Pakistan has strong links to China and other countries, but no one is as obsequious as Trudeau. That's what I don't think.
And there's a long history. So here we are. We touched upon recent human rights violations, recent environmental destruction by China, their trade view. But Ezra, I go back 30 years, I think, when practicing law, or 25 years, when China was dumping things into our markets, and we had to create legislation. And they have been offenders of trade dumping. They've been offenders of stealing patents. I mean, I know of Nortel employees, and Nortel doesn't exist, where China stole, patents and technology. So here you have this regime that's when it comes to commerce, it's certainly not acting fair. When it comes to human rights, there isn't a hint of human rights in this country. When it comes to their environment, they simply play and use us. And now we are facing with this deadly virus that they obviously knew about. They obviously unleashed it on the Western world, on the whole world, and they knew about it. They were reckless or intentional, I don't know, but certainly reckless in hiding it. And did they create it or not? There's a lot of good evidence. And here you have Canadians dying. Our economy, we're going to be $1 trillion in debt. And we're not even asking, hey, why is China doing this? Or why are we not looking at China? I mean, what does Canada have to completely shut down before we wake up to this?
Yeah, I find it very odd. Well, let me look at something that caught my eye. China, of course, is sitting on the world's largest foreign currency reserves. I think it's $2 or $3 trillion. Now, throwing the word trillion around a lot these days, but still, to have that much cash just sitting on hand, they could buy anything they want that's for sale. And that thing, I was Prime Minister, he said Chinese state-owned enterprises had to have a security review before they could buy critical industries in Canada. Makes sense, because it's not really a Chinese company, it's the Chinese government. And I see China's got all this foreign currency reserves, and the Chinese virus has flattened the world's economy. So basically, everything's on fire sale, bankruptcy sale. And look at this. This is a story from Nunatsiaq in Nunavut, and hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. This is from the Nunatsiaq News. So it's a northern mine. Now, it's a gold mine, so it's not like a rare earth metal or something, but still, it was China that smashed us. And now China, the Shandong Gold Company, coming in to swoop up, a $250 million deal in the north. I mean, maybe it doesn't matter if they own a mine in northern Canada, although I like to think that the north is a strategic place. And I fear that they're going to bring in their own Chinese laborers with their own Chinese labor law like they do in Africa. How do you feel, Manny, about China bringing some of that $2-3 trillion to buy up our distressed assets, given that they were the ones who put us in distress?
Well, that's a very good observation. I read that article as well. It's happening in Africa. It's happening in countries that are depressed already, distressed already. China is increasing its footprint around the world, and certainly the way China does it, is that it knows that all it has to do is spend a few dollars on a few top politicians in that jurisdiction. We've heard stories about American senators. We've heard stories, certainly in Africa. It is quite simple for China. China knows that these politicians are here for a little while, and a lot of money in a little time will go a long way in their 100-year plan. I think China is faced with a remarkable foe, a remarkable wall, a remarkable resistance in the President of the United States. China would have got to their accomplishment in 10 years, and we would have seen a world that we would not recognize. And up comes this non-politician that thwarts it. I do believe, there's certainly, I would love to gather the evidence, but there has to be some way of connecting what's happening now to the presidential elections. Certainly, China doesn't want to see Trump reelected. China would prefer to continue mopping up the world without any person on the wall, as I put it. So I think you're right. I think this is strategic. I think you buy assets, you topple industry. Here was Trump with the strongest economy, moving everything back to America, attacking the $500 billion deficit. That's a lot of money Americans are paying to keep that Chinese economy going. Trump understood it, and so you have a different set of rules. And so, Ezra, I wouldn't put it past that being. I would love to investigate it. I would love to get the evidence, but I truly believe China knows what it's doing. I think part of this is intentional, and certainly you buy the liberal media. To sit there and have them on your side, that's not hard to do. To get politicians on your side, that's not hard to do. So China is extending its 100-year plan, and I want a world where we're free. I want a world where China is not the dominant power.
Yeah. Some people support China for ideological reasons. I'd probably put Trudeau in that camp. His brother, certainly Alexandre, is a huge super fan of China, like he is for Iran and Cuba. Some people do it just for the money. The NBA, Hollywood, It's just about the market. some people do it because they've been blackmailed, maybe. I want to ask you about a kind of stealthy influence peddling. We saw this when the Huawei Meng Wanzhou arrest happened. The University of British Columbia, it was revealed, I think, in the Vancouver Sun, went into panic mode because they rely on money from Huawei. They didn't want to be caught up in things. And it pulled back the curtain a bit on just how much the Chinese state and its agents had infiltrated, not in like an espionage way, but just influence and money and donations and 5 million here and 1 million there. And let me just throw one more analogy to you. And we see reports in the United States every few months of a professor in some high-tech area who is taking money from China and not disclosing it, being arrested for espionage. It reminds me of Jeffrey Epstein, the pedophile financier who met a suspicious death in jail recently. It was later revealed that he was a strategic donor to various universities. I think he even had an office and a phone number at Harvard. How? He wasn't a scholar. He was a horrific man by all accounts. It was money. You give 1 million, 2 million, 5 million, 10 million, and all of a sudden the red carpet's out to you. I think that Chinese money from the government, from Chinese-backed companies like Huawei, I think that is really a way they've got into our institutions. Companies, universities, think tanks. You're a think tank, you're always fundraising. Well, maybe you pull in your claws a bit if you get 100 grand or 1 million or 10 million from China. I'm brainstorming, but I think China's influence is deep and in many of our institutions.
Well, it's a good brainstorm. The question that has to be asked, and it just flies in the face of all the facts. Why is Prime Minister Trudeau, when you look at the history of China dumping, the history of China stealing patents, the history of China in basically imprisoning 2 Canadians, the history of China terminating canola purchases just on a whim, pork purchases, the history of China buying dirty coal, and the history of China human rights violations. Why? I mean, Ezra, here's the $1 million question. Why is a guy who holds himself out, our prime minister, as a human rights advocate, wanted to be the leader in the world on that and failed miserably, because we know that he doesn't truly believe in human rights, but a human rights advocate, an environmental advocate, a trade advocate, why is he, and now we have the coronavirus that has basically devastated our public accounts, $1 trillion it's going to be, has killed Canadians, has made Canadians ill, has destroyed our way of life, our liberties. Why has this prime minister not been the first to speak out against the horrors of what China is doing? Yeah. And Ezra, I'm telling you, everything I look at it, when you look at facts and see why someone behaving this way, there's generally 2 or 3 reasons why, and they're all not very good reasons. These are very scary things.
I wonder if we'll ever find out in the United States. Well, WikiLeaks and DC leaks to show us some of the secret emails and documents. I think it might wait for that.
Well, we have, we have a robust media. We have thousands of good reporters that are not even asking the questions. There's Rebel out there that's asking the questions, and I cannot believe that we are all not standing on our toes, media, Canadians, and yelling, what is this relationship with China and Canada based on, especially now some talk, and I'll give them, some say that you need China to get that seat that the prime minister seems to want to get on the UN. But if that seat's worth our human rights, our environment, our trade, people's lives, someone should ask that question, whether that seat in the UN is that important.
Manny, there's so much to think about. Thank you so much for bringing the smarts.
No problem.
As you always do. Great to see you, my friend. Keep up the fight.
Thank you. Take care.
All right, there you have it. Manny Montenegrino, the CEO of Think Sharp. He joined us today via Skype from Ottawa. That's an excerpt from my daily show, the Ezra Levant Show. Every day I do a monologue on the news of the day, then I interview an interesting guest, and then I read my hate mail. You gotta subscribe. Go to rebelnews.com.